Hey everyone, hope you're having a good week. Today I want to pivot a little bit to talk about campaign finance as an important topic in American politics today. And, over the past couple of modules, we've been thinking a lot about influence, and especially the way that individuals coming together into groups might be able to exert pressure on elected politicians to be able to provide them with the goods that they are interested in, essentially to be able to, get the things that they want in terms of the question of who gets what. And so, in doing so, I think that we could answer this question that I've got here on the slide for you of, what are some of these ways that we could affect politics in a variety of ways. And certainly this is good preparation for your final exam. We could think about, amicus curiae briefs, for example, that organized interests could submit, direct lobbying, or, any number of different ways that those organized interests could go public. But certainly, with the 2020 election sort of in our minds at the present moment, we want to think also about the ways in which these groups can influence politics through campaign contributions. And so in discussing this, the first question I want to ask is, maybe there are some disincentives to doing this, right? I know obviously we're coming to this with the prior that there is a lot of money in politics today, but I think sort of turning the question on its head would be interesting, right? And if we think about corporations, there may be good reasons why some corporations might be disinterested in donating to politics, perhaps partially because they're worried that it could hurt their business, right? Being associated with a political candidate could be potentially damaging if that candidate were to do something that the public didn't like. In terms of nonprofits, we actually will see in just a moment some reasons why nonprofits and these other organizations might actually be legally limited in terms of the extent to which they can get involved in electoral politics. And as an individual, we can also look to the FEC, or the Federal Election Commission, which provides certain caps on the amount of money that we can donate to specific candidates or other groups. And so we're going to get into some of the details of that system in just a moment. But really the number that I want you to focus on right now is this idea that as an individual, regardless of who you are, we can only donate around $2,700 to a specific candidate in one election cycle. So if you liked, let's say a candidate who was running for the House of Representatives in the state of Maryland, and you wanted to donate to that candidate as an individual, even though you might have $1 billion in the bank, you can really only donate $2,700 directly to that candidate's campaign. And again, you might be thinking to yourself, well, if this is the case, then how is it still that there are billions of dollars in campaigns today? Well, I think to understand the answer to that question, we need to look at some of the rules. And so here's the sort of question that I just asked, right? How is this possible? The first thing I want to get into here is this discussion of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. I know I've already discussed or mentioned briefly the Federal Election Commission as being the sort of bureaucracy that's in charge of regulating the way that elections are run at the federal level, specifically as it concerns campaign finance. But the IRS is just as, if not more important, to understanding how money actually works in politics today. And so the IRS oversees these regulations, and particularly they have essentially pieces of the tax code that allow for either money to flow to politics for campaigning purposes, or other lines in the tax code which prohibit money being used for politics. And so I want to think, first of all, about, for example, 501c3 groups. So these are charitable groups. I think, for example, there's a variety of 501c3s that operate in Maryland. The Oyster Recovery Program is a 501c3. BARCS, the pet adoption rescue organization in Baltimore, is also a 501c3. Of a number of different organizations that exist to sort of further these charitable goals can be classified as 501c3s. And when you donate money to a 501c3, say that you want to give a year-end charitable gift to one of these organizations like BARCS, you want to help them pay for pet food to keep these puppies, before they get adopted out. Then that's tax deductible, which means that you will not, essentially the government doesn't see that money that you've donated when it comes at the end of the year to assess your final tax bill. And so if you donate to these groups, you can be rest assured that your money is not going for political purposes, because groups are prohibited, if they're a 501c3, from engaging in electoral politics. And again, even though they can raise this unlimited tax-free money. So if you had $1 billion in the bank, you could give all $1 billion to one of these 501c3s. You wouldn't pay any taxes, but you'd certainly be able to give all of that money away to these groups. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that 501c3s are able to engage in what's called sort of public education campaigns. So you might see a commercial, for example, on the TV that is telling people about how endangered certain species are, or how it's important to support your local food bank or some sort of homeless shelter or something. But again, they can make no explicit political statements about candidates. That's one of the big limitations of a 501c3 when it comes to politics. Now, if we were to go over just one line in the tax code to 501c4s, we would see a little bit of a difference. So again, this is just the next line down in the tax code. There's the description of another kind of group, 501c4. These groups actually can engage in electoral political communications, which means that they can make statements about sort of the candidates in elections, as long as essentially no more than 49.99% of their money is being spent on that purpose. So they have to do something else beyond just electioneering in order for them to count as a 501c4. And they have to prove that at the end of the year to the IRS that they've spent the majority of their money, even if it's a very slim majority, on something other than politics. These are actually pretty important and powerful groups, however, and that's particularly because these groups can receive unlimited contributions and they do not have to disclose donors, which means that essentially when you donate to a 501c4, even though you can be pretty sure that less than half of that money is going to be used for politics, for trying to elect candidates, you know that you're never going to have your name associated with that contribution. So that money that goes to a 501c4 is what we might call dark money. So even in this first description of two pieces of the tax code, we see that there are a couple of different vehicles out there for individuals, and in this case, largely wealthy individuals, to make direct contributions, but only one of them allows them to make political contributions without disclosure. Now, in this discussion, I also want to get into some of the FEC's rules, right? So the Federal Election Commission, this bureaucracy that's in charge of handling some of these campaign finance considerations. And particularly, I want to go back to the 1970s and think about a specific law called FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act. And so FECA was actually a very important piece of legislation that sought to sort of reform this system because in the 70s, people started to notice that there was a lot more money being spent in politics than had been before. And so one of the goals of FECA was to sort of limit the degree to which money could be sent to candidates without disclosure, right? They wanted to put some sunlight, you might say, into this setup. And so they made a rule that says that direct political contributions in excess of $200 have to be made public. And so if you were to, for example, go to opensecrets.org and take a look at some of the campaign donations in this cycle, you'd be able to see quite clearly who donated money directly to candidates on a website like that aggregates these filings that need to be submitted to the FEC at certain deadlines in order for a candidate not to be found in violation of FEC rules. But FEC actually, and the FECA legislation actually went further than that, because what FECA was mostly trying to rein in was this new type of group that had emerged in the late 1960s, early 1970s, called a PAC, or a Political Action Committee. I know many of you have probably heard about these PACs. I want to go back in time to sort of the origin story of PACs. And you might see that PACs as we think of them today are quite different, actually, than the kinds of PACs that FECA was trying to limit. And in fact, it turns out that this is partially because PACs, as they were designed then, sort of FECA's attempt to limit them ended up turning them into, inadvertently, sort of a different kind of monster. So PACs actually, turns out, were originally generally created by unions. And so people who were union members were able to join a PAC that was created by the union as an independent vehicle to help funnel money to specific candidates across the country where that money would have the highest impact. So if you were, say, living in Maryland and you were a union employee and you wanted to support candidates that were going to do pro-union stuff, and it turns out that your local district had a candidate that was, pretty constantly winning 90-10, right? 90%, getting 90% of the vote, your dollar going to this candidate is not going to make much of a difference because that candidate is in a very safe district where they're just winning all the time without your help. Right? You don't need to send your money to, John Q. candidate who's running in your district just because your district is so non-competitive. But what a PAC does is it might allow people to come together take those donations, put them into a single vehicle, and then that dollar that you would have otherwise spent on somebody in your district that you know about could be sent across the country to a race in Arkansas where a pro-union candidate was neck and neck with somebody who was against unions. And so maybe that dollar being spent over there would have much more of an impact and result in a Congress that overall would be more favorable to your union. So in this sense, PACs were very powerful tools, and tools that allowed for this outside independent spending to start to grow in these specific competitive races. So FECA, because we know that politicians are very resistant to change, saw this change to the landscape of elections and said, this is very scary. We want to try to limit this. And so, again, the original definition of PACs is it's really groups that organize and channel disclosed donations of individuals to specific candidates. I think, for example, of a group called Emily's List, which is a very sort of historic PAC. And in fact, Emily is not the name of a person. It's actually an acronym. And it stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. And so the idea being that if Emily's List is able to aggregate contributions from individuals who support the causes that Emily's List supports, they'll be able to inject that cash into races where candidates are in desperate need of the early money they need to engage in more and better fundraising. So again, corporations, unions, membership organizations, or trade associations now all have PACs. And in fact, the sort of PAC landscape has, over time, become inundated with more and more and more PACs. Again, this is just to reiterate, what PACs are doing is they're not allowing for millions and millions of dollars to come in from a single individual and then sort of having those being spent nationally. What they do is they bundle donations, usually small donations from individuals, and then it injects them into specific campaigns. And again, these are independent organizations, which means that these are not communicating directly with any campaign, candidate, or party in terms of the actual day-to-day functioning of the PAC and the decisions the PAC makes. Now, FECA was an attempt to limit the power of PACs, and certainly FECA did so in its legislation. But of course, we know that part of the system of checks and balances that we have as interpreted by the framers of the Constitution and John Marshall is this notion of judicial review. And so in Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, we saw that the total fundraising limits that FECA placed on PACs were actually ruled unconstitutional. And so what ended up happening was this sort of FECA legislation that was going to put hard limits on PACs actually ended up creating a Wild West of PACs by even further removing restrictions. And so, today, PAC contributions are still limited to a certain extent, right? An individual can only make a $5,000 donation to any one specific PAC. With the explosion of the availability and the number of PACs out there, we now see that a lot more money can come into the system, because PACs are able to coordinate unlimited total amounts. So they can gain contributions from any number of individuals and become very large sort of balloons full of cash that they can then inject into specific races. So again, $5,000 per person from any group member, which now really means nothing, right? Any individual who has an interest in donating to a PAC can do so. Individuals can also spend up to $25,000 a year on any committees. So basically, you could make the maximum contribution to 5 PACs in a given year. But in 2014, even those limits were nullified by McCutcheon versus FEC. So now essentially you can make a $5,000 contribution to any number of PACs and in that way spread your money around a lot, but still spend a lot of money. So this is one of the trends that we've seen in terms of individuals being able to have a much greater effect on the political system than that $2,700 individual contribution limit that we saw earlier. And so, PACs can also take those $2,700 or less checks and bundle them together, also helping them to be directed to candidates. So again, bundling and directing is really what PACs are doing, and they can do so in a much bigger way, at a large scale now, because there are simply so many of them available to contributors in the campaign space. All right, so of course, it goes without saying that PACs are incredibly powerful today, and this coordinated contribution sort of setup is one of the ways that incredibly competitive races, like we might see in the 2020 the runoff elections in Georgia, right, following the 2020 election. These runoff elections were likely to see a very large amount of money being spent, partially because PACs are able to coordinate national level donations to go into these races in particular. But again, PACs can also engage, what they're doing with this money is they can engage in advertising, right? So independent candidate campaigning, where they're able to talk about the politics, in a specific area, and they can urge voters to either support or not support candidates with very carefully worded language. And so the court has sort of time and time again considered this question and said, well, if you support these PACs through your contributions, and the PACs choose to run ads, many of them like negative attack ads, for example, this can be considered to be an expression of free speech, as long as the campaign is not coordinating those ads with their own. And again, you'll often see in these kinds of ads, these outside spending ads, some really funky language. Like they won't say vote for or vote against, but they'll say things like, tell Congress that so-and-so is a bad choice, right? Or, they'll highlight some sort of issue that the person has done a bad job on, or they'll say, so-and-so, the wrong choice for Maryland or something like that, because they need to avoid some of these words in order to be classified as independent. So PACs are powerful, they run these ads, and they're very careful to run ads that are going to pass muster with the FEC. But that's not the only group that we need to talk about. 527s actually are another group that really is, I think, a big story in today's politics. So 527 groups actually, again, going back to the distinction between rules set up by the FEC and rules that are set up by the IRS, 527 groups are, again, a kind of IRS designation for a specific kind of group. And so what 527s are is compared to, some of these other tax deductible, like a 501c3 or a 501c4, these 527 groups are still sort of nonprofits, right? Tax deductible nonprofits, but they have a specific advantage that comes from their definition. So 527s are what's called issue advocacy groups, which means that, again, as long as you use this funky language that doesn't say vote for or against, it turns out that these groups can raise an unlimited amount of money from individuals, the same way that you could donate $1 billion to your local 501c3 without any sanctions. You can actually donate this money to 527s for the purposes of issue advocacy, but again, with carefully worded communications, these issue advocacy communications can end up feeling and looking and sounding like, and essentially being, campaign ads, right? Because they get run in districts where there are competitive elections and they're about the candidates in question. And so the major advantage for donors here is that, again, with PACs, the limit for any individual PAC is still $5,000. You could donate to a lot of PACs, but that's a very inefficient way to do this, right? You have to do a lot of research and figure out which PACs to put all this money to. If you want to spend, $10 million to influence an election, 527s give you the best bang for your buck, because you can just give it all to a single 527, and you can see that money being spent on ads almost immediately. The last thing that I want to talk about, in addition to 501c3s, 501c4s, PACs, those conventional PACs we talked about, and then 527s, is political parties. So political parties are also groups that can engage in a lot of fundraising and a lot of spending through what we call party building activities. And so this is what's called soft money. It comes through the party itself. And again, it often goes towards advertising, which gets deployed before elections, that again is able to tread very carefully around some of those vote for, vote against kind of terms that allows it to essentially become a campaign advertisement in all but name. Now, in the 2000s, right after Bush v. Gore, which was one election which many commentators at the time really pointed to as an example of rapidly increasing campaign spending. Certainly during that election, it was kind of the first time that a lot of people said, wow, campaign spending is incredibly large all of a sudden, and it seems to be getting out of hand. Congress again tried to act to try to limit this explosion of things like 527s and things like PACs. And the way they did this was to try to pass a piece of legislation called BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. And so BICRA in 2002 was essentially had the goal of trying to really cap 527 specifically. Because again, if you're a billionaire, you want to give millions of dollars to influence a single election, a 527 is a very easy way to do it. And they said we need to try to limit the effects of 527s by putting individual donation caps on specific 527s. However, only 8 years later, the Supreme Court would take up this law through a very famous court case that you probably have heard about called Citizens United versus FEC. And in Citizens United, the ruling was essentially that restrictions or limits, caps on the size of these contributions are unconstitutional. And again, this has been a widely criticized decision, and one that has been, I think, one of the biggest kind of talking points for sort of reformers and people who want there to be sort of higher quality democracy in America since then. But I think, that we have to remember, of course, that these groups that are being talked about were originally conceived of as issue advocacy groups. And so to deprive people of the sort of freedom to donate to issue advocacy groups, I think the Supreme Court in this case really struggled with the question of sort of, is this a slippery slope, right? At what point are we able to adjudicate between what is actually issue advocacy, right? Which really, I think that's enshrined very, very closely in our free speech kind of freedoms, versus what is base electioneering. And so these kinds of questions really stymied the court, and I think this is one of the reasons why we had this extremely unpopular decision emerge. Again, if you've heard the criticism, like corporations aren't people, or essentially, the federal government thinks corporations are people, that's really where this comes from. And so, again, this court case is perhaps one of the most important moments in modern American history. As a result, we now have a lot of 527 groups that are known as super PACs, right? Because again, they're sort of these independent expenditure committees. They can't make direct contributions to candidates, but the difference is that they can raise unlimited amounts of money, despite the fact that, of course, they have to disclose their donors. And so if you're somebody who does not care whether or not your name gets out there as a person who's donated millions of dollars to a candidate, this is, again, your best bet to be able to inject a race with millions and millions of dollars. However, of course, as we talked about, if you're a shy supporter of a candidate, it's much easier, but perhaps not as immediately effective to donate to a 501c4, and have that money get sort of quietly shunted to candidate ads. So again, dark money, which is the no disclosure kinds of contributions, still comes through 501c4s. And again, that dilutes the impact of each dollar spent on politics. But really, this is kind of a choose your own adventure for very wealthy people. Either come out as a supporter of a candidate and have all your money count, or be a little bit more discreet and sort of split your money halfway between some non-political sort of content and expressly political content. So really, as we kind of wrap up today, what I want to think about, and certainly this is a topic that we'll take up in our next class discussion, is what do we think about this, right? Are there public policy solutions that we can engage in if we think this is a problem? And particularly, I want to know what we think about the potential consequences for this campaign finance sort of picture. Right? Does it appear that the rise of spending, especially outside spending in the 527s, does this seem to be correlated with, does this seem to have some kind of influence on some of the sort of problems that we've identified in American politics today, right? Is this a driver of polarization, for example? Or is this a driver perhaps of inequality, right? Social and economic inequality? Could this be part of this story? And so as we think about these concepts and think about polarization, think about representation, the quality of candidates that are being voted for in American democracy today, this is, again, I think, good practice to be thinking like a social scientist, trying to trace the sources of certain phenomena to their effects, right, to the phenomena themselves. And so for the rest of the week, as you're thinking about this and mulling over these topics, and certainly preparing for the final exam, I really encourage you to try to piece together in your head a theory of why and how you might think that campaign finance is related to the sort of modern political context that we're in. Until then, though, I wish you the best in your preparations, and I very much look forward to our next discussion. So long, everyone.